Like this? Okay. Better. All right, good evening. I'm glad to still see some faces here. Last session on a Friday evening, so thanks for coming. In this session, we're going to talk about OpenAPI or Swagger. And we're going to go a bit beyond just adding add Swagger gen to your request pipeline. We're going to go a bit further than that. So you'll learn about documenting with Swagger, but you'll also learn what else such a Swagger specification or OpenAPI specification can be used for. But let me introduce myself first. I'm Kevin. I'm a solution architect. Been working in this sector for about 15 years now. And I mainly focus on APIs and security these days, which is probably why I'm doing a session on documenting APIs. So that's the reason. You can find the link to my GitHub on screen there, and that's where you can find the code for this session. So it's already on there, but don't run away yet. I still have to explain what it does. There's also quite a few open source projects on there, and I always need help. So if you feel like contributing to an open source project, just have a look, open an issue, send a pull request, and I'll be very happy with that. Okay. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to start with why you could use or should use OpenAPI to document your API. In essence, why you should document your API in the first place. Then we're going to try and clear up a bit of terminology confusion. I guess most of you have heard of Swagger. Yeah? Used it? Yeah, probably most of you have used it even. Well, there's Swagger, there's OpenAPI, there's Swagger CodeGen, there's Swagger UI, there's Swashbuckle, there's Anthrax Studio, and more. And they're used intertwinedly, or what is the word? I'm going to try and clear up the confusion a bit surrounding that. Then we'll look into the importance of API Explorer. It's a built-in service in ASP.NET Core, and it's actually what drives something like OpenAPI generation. So it's quite important to know where the data for OpenAPI generation comes from. That's what that does. We'll look into how we can use attributes to produce correct response types and why that is important. We'll look at that at a controller or method action level and at a global level. And we'll learn what we can do at a global level and what we can do at action level. We'll also look into relatively new feature analyzers. There's an API analyzer that can help you with producing correct documentation for your API. And we'll also look into a bit of an advanced topic, advanced content negotiation and schema variation. It's new since OpenAPI 3. So in the old versions, this wasn't supported and wasn't possible. But obviously, it is possible in REST. So a lot of RESTful APIs couldn't correctly be documented with old OpenAPI or Swagger versions. But now they can. So we'll look into how we can do that. All right. So this might seem very obvious. The beginning, why we should document an API or why we should use Swagger or something to document an API. It's obvious for public API, so I don't think I even need to explain that. If you need to monetize your API, you probably want people who pay to use your API to know how to correctly use it. Otherwise, they're going to complain. So you need decent documentation. But in-company APIs also need that. Maybe if the company you're working for is small, then you don't really need it, except for your fellow developers, obviously. But in large companies, there often are various teams working on various pieces of software, and not all teams know from each other that they are working on something or know they are building APIs that may already offer what they need. And that actually costs money. This is not something I just put on a slide because it makes sense or because it sounds good. One of my clients actually, they was a pretty big company and they had 3 different APIs, mostly doing the same, all built separately from each other before they even knew that they were building that. So one was already there, and then 2 other APIs all of a sudden appeared because their client applications needed it, and it offered more or less the same functionality. Now, needless to say, that costs a lot of money to create, and if you have clear documentation and a place where you can let the other teams know, obviously, that the APIs exist. Well, that will save time and money. So that's trying to sell OpenAPI or Swagger. And what is such an OpenAPI specification then? Well, it's actually a bit of JSON or YAML, and it describes the capabilities of your API and how to interact with it. That's what the specification OpenAPI is. And maybe we should look at one. I have a project running here. This is not the demo project, by the way. It's a bit a version of the demo project which has a bit more implemented already. But it's also on my GitHub if you need it. Let's have a look at such a Swagger specification. I'm going to make this a bit bigger. So how is this built? Let me start by closing this like this. So you can see a few paths. Those are the paths to the routes and the resources my API has to offer. And you can click them open, obviously. Once you click open one, for example, let's say for an author, you can see the methods that are supported on that author. And if you go a bit deeper, you can find the parameters that are inputted, including the types and potentially descriptions of those. And you can also find the potential response types, potential response status codes, I mean, 204 and 401, 404, so quite a few. Most APIs have quite a few potential response codes. And if you look at those response codes, you can also see, let's take this one, that they refer to a certain schema for application JSON or an application XML in this case. And if you look down, I'm going to look for that. Then we find, where was it? Author. Here's the author object. So that's essentially a description of my author DTO class. So if you look at this, you can already see that this is a pretty good description of my API and the capabilities. If you were to look at the post, you would also see a description of the input scheme, input DTO. So from this kind of follows that even though we are all used to creating those OpenAPI specifications and then adding Swagger UI to have our nice documentation and a testing tool as well, because it's a testing tool as well, there's more that can be done with such a specification. Let's have a look at that. So this is our specification. What do we need first? Well, we need something to, let me put it on like that. We need something to create that specification. We're not going to write this ourselves. Well, we could. It's going to cost a lot of time. We want something to inspect our API and generate that JSON document from. That's the thing on the left. That's a tool on the left. Then you have that JSON or YAML specification, and you need to use it for something. For example, to generate, that's the thing on the right, to generate the API documentation from. A website, that's Swagger UI, a website containing a description of the API and an ability to test it. But it can be used for more. If we can generate a UI from it, well, we can also generate client-side classes from it. From that specification, we've seen that it describes the model, the DTOs. So imagine you have an Angular client. Well, you can use such a specification to generate your Angular classes, or the interfaces in this case, from. You can even generate full client applications, including HTTP requests, to interact with your API from it. And you can also rudimentary, Postman kind of supports it, rudimentary use it for helping with generating tests for your API. That's a few of the use cases for it. And then we come to how all those components work together. The full spec can be read on the link. I'm not going to bore you with that. It's an insanely large specification. And once you start working with this and start researching all of this stuff, you end up with lots of terminology. Swagger, Swashbuckle, OpenAPI, stuff like that. I prefer to use OpenAPI for a Swagger specification, an OpenAPI spec. Swagger used to be the terminology that was used, but since OpenAPI 3, people who made it prefer to use OpenAPI. So that's the way forward, I think. If you look at it in the ASP.NET Core classes, Microsoft provided a lot of classes built into ASP.NET Core that help with generating Swagger specifications or OpenAPI specs. They also name them OpenAPI. So that's more or less the terminology they want to use now. So an OpenAPI spec and a Swagger spec are the same. Swagger in itself, it's more than just that. So Swagger is a set of open source tools built around that OpenAPI specification. If you look at the official Swagger site, you will find Swagger editor. You can edit your Swagger file online on the site, create it. Swagger UI then takes that specification and renders a UI from it. And Swagger CodeGen, that's a full set of tools used to, for example, generate full clients, generate some client classes, help with generating some tests from that specification. And this is just Swagger as the people who made it intended it. As this is a fully standardized specification, you also see other tools showing up in other languages like .NET Core. And that's where we come to Swashbuckle. So swashbuckle.asp.NET Core is a library that helps with working with OpenAPI and ASP.NET Core. It generates the specification from your API, and it uses Swagger UI to generate that documentation UI from. And then you have other competition actually. Anthrax Studio is a bit of a competitor to Swashbuckle. And it kind of does the same thing as Swashbuckle does. Now, the nice thing though is that this is fully based on a standard. So I can just use whatever I want to use and whatever I prefer to use. Personally, I like Swashbuckle more than Anthrax Studio for generating my spec and eventually the UI through Swagger UI. But I like Anthrax Studio better for client-side code generation. So I just use the specification created by Swashbuckle to generate client-side code from using Anthrax Studio. And that can happen thanks to the fact that it's based on standards. All right, that was a lot of talk and not much code. So let's dive into code a bit by setting this up. For those of you who've worked with Swagger, the beginning is going to look pretty familiar, I think. All right, let me close this because that was the one that just generated the spec we're not going to use. Here we are. Open. Let's see. There we are. All right. I'm going to start at the very, very beginning. This is a simple API that exposes some books and authors. Nothing special about it. It has an authors controller and a books controller, obviously, and it's an ASP.NET Core API. Pretty simple. I want to add Swagger to it. So I want to add OpenAPI support to it. See, for me, it's also, I also switch Swagger and OpenAPI, and I think it's never gonna clear up in my head. So the first thing you want to do to get this up and running is, let's have a look at the NuGet packages, is add swashbuckle.asp.NET Core. Now, I already added it, and I added the beta version, 5.0.0 beta. It's not released yet. There are RCs, so we're up to RC4, I think. But I've noticed that, especially with ASP.NET Core 3, so I switched back to ASP.NET Core 2.2 for this demo, especially with ASP.NET Core 3 and the RC versions, things go wrong. Things go wrong terribly once you start working with operation filters, which we'll do later on. So once you go beyond the built-in and the easy stuff, the RC isn't really up to par yet for working, for example, with schema variation. The beta, on the other hand, somehow is. So I currently choose the beta, and I really hope that by the time it gets released, that it will be a bit better than the current RC version. That's just for your information. So I've already added it. And the first thing I want to do is add the necessary services to my container and configure them. So in the configure services method, let me just have a look here. I have a lot of regions in code, which is very easy during demos. Otherwise, you would have to wait for me to type all of this. It's very boring. So I call into add SwaggerGen. What that does is register the necessary services on the IOC container, the built-in IOC container in Microsoft ASP.NET Core. And then I state that I want to create or add one Swagger doc or one OpenAPI specification. You can add multiple if you want. Once you start working with versions, for example, you could add multiples. But in this case, we're going to add one. Here you can already find one of those classes I talked about. If you've worked with Swagger or Swashbuckle in a previous version, you probably know that this wasn't used yet. This is quite new, since ASP.NET Core 2.1, I think, so relatively new. And it really ties in better with the ASP.NET Core framework and API Explorer, as we'll learn later on. Next to that, the OpenAPI information simply allows me to set some information on my specification. So the thing to remember is this here. That's the name I gave to my OpenAPI specification. So what this will do, this will already ensure that everything is configured as I want it to be. Then we want to use the thing that comes out of it, so the actual JSON file that's generated by setting it up like this. We want to show this or let the UI use that specification for creating itself. Actually. So we need to add something to the request pipeline. Use Swagger UI also from Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core allows for that. And here is where I have to set the Swagger endpoint. So this needs to refer to my OpenAPI specification. And the OpenAPI specification is by default generated at Swagger / the name I gave, a bit higher up in the code, / swagger.json. And then I give it another name. Something I like to do is add a route prefix and set it to an empty string. That'll ensure that whenever I start up the API, the documentation comes up at the root instead of that normal not found page. And that's the very basic setup. So let's see what that results in. Not very much, I think. That's a bit big. I don't know. 200%. So this is what we already get. And well, it is already something. I mean, you can see where my resources live. You can see which actions are possible on them, so the HTTP methods. And you could already start testing from here. So this is already something. There's also a lot missing, but we'll get to that. You can have a look at the spec. So this is what this resulted in here. You can see the input I gave. And the other input is generated by swashbuckle.asp.NET Core. So this is what we end up with. But one of the things that are often done are code comments. So you don't just describe your API, you also describe what you do in your code for your fellow developers. And I actually already have that. So I have a bit of code comments. But somehow, here for example, so I have a summary and I have some parameter names, etc. This is already commented in code. Well, it would be nice if I could take these comments and just have them end up in my Swagger, in my UI, so in my OpenAPI specification. And that's actually also quite easy to do. These are XML comments, so the first thing we need to do is generate those. You can do that by having a look at the properties, the build, and click generate XML documentation file. So that's down here. There we go. And it will by default be named library.xml. That's okay. Just put it in the root. Easier to refer to. And let's save this. So now from all those code comments, an XML file will be generated, and we want to tell Swashbuckle that it needs to take that XML file and use it to generate the OpenAPI spec from, or help it generate the OpenAPI spec from. So we configured it in configure services, and that's where we need to tell it that it has to go and look for the XML file. So that's this region here. The first thing to do, I need to get that XML file. The name by default was library.api, which is the name of my project. So I can easily get to that by getting the executing assembly and name, .xml. And then we need to load it. So that's a simple path combine statement, going from the base there and adding the XML comments file. It's this statement that's the important one here, include XML comments on the setup action we used to set up here, to set up Swagger generation. And from this moment on, this will be included and we will see the comment show up. Well, let's have a look. This is already a bit better. Get a list of authors, that's from my comments. And if we go down here, these are comments I included on my author DTO class. So let's have a look at that, just to prove that I'm not lying. Here we go. So those are those comments coming up. So that actually works pretty easily and more or less out of the box. But there's quite a bit missing still, and it's actually still, this documentation isn't even correct. So, for example, let's say if you look at getting one specific author. According to my documentation, the only thing that can be returned is a 200 OK with one author. But that does not make sense. And getting one author, well, that can easily return a 404 not found. If you have some authorization or authentication set up on your API, you will also be able to see a 401 or a 403. You are probably always going to be able to get a 500 internal server error back from your API call, and so on. So there's a lot more response types that your API will support than what is visible on screen here. And even though a 200 OK is still correct, but this is incomplete, if you look at a post statement, for example, we see that it also generated a 200 OK, which doesn't make sense. Post would return a 201 created. So this is actually just wrong. This is a mistake in my documentation. Let's see how we can fix that. Yeah. I'm going to go here first. To help documenting your API, Microsoft introduced a few attributes that can help with it. Those are the produces response type attributes. And by, for example, getting authors, let's have a look at that one. By stating that this action can produce a 200 OK, 400 batch request, 500 internal server error, 406 not acceptable. By stating that, this will automatically end up in my API documentation, so in my Swagger doc. So that already helps towards getting better documentation. Well, let's have a look. I think I did it on authors. All right, so here they are. This is already looking a bit better to me, sort of. But, well, all the others don't include that yet. So those response type attributes, you could go and add them on each action. But, well, that becomes boring quite fast. And a lot of actions will have a bunch of response types that are globally possible for all of them, for all of the resources. So you can also add, those are essentially filters, so you can add them globally as well. So let's have a look at that. In the startup class, when you call into add MVC, you can add filters. So we know that any request to our API can return a 400 batch request, 406 not acceptable and 500 internal server error. So we add those as global filters. And then that last one is an important one as well. For everything you don't want to specifically describe, but returns the same problem details object, so the default that's returned when there's a problem, I prefer to add a default response type attribute. We'll see what that ends up with. Like that, people who consume your API know that if an error code or a status code is returned that isn't specifically described, it will return something in this format. Right. Now, I just added 400 batch requests, 406 not acceptable, and 500 internal server error globally, so I don't need that here anymore. Okay, let's give that another try. Interestingly enough, my Visual Studio already started asking if I wanted to include a Roslyn analyzer. That's essentially what we're going to do in a few minutes. So, very helpful today. All right, so I think we did it on get authors. Now let's have a look at get a specific author. Here are those response type codes as well, including the default, so stating that whatever else isn't specifically described, it will return something of this format. So like that, your clients know a bit better what to expect. All right. Now, back to that contract, because that's actually what we are designing. We're creating documentation for our API, but we are actually describing our APIs. We are not just creating documentation, we are writing the contract our API should adhere to. The contract client should know to interact with our API. And this is a bit of a general tip. Whenever you start designing an API, don't just start developing. But personally, I prefer to take pen and paper and just start writing down, okay, this is a resource and I want to interact with it via put or post. That's going to be returned. This is going to be the input, something like that. So before I start coding all of that stuff, I prefer to have a bunch of paper with my resources and methods and media types, obviously, written down. So that's the three parts of a contract. It's always a resource identifier, the URI, the HTTP method, and the media type. So those three are quite essential. But I have to say, once I started working with OpenAPI a bit more, that my methodology has been changing a bit. These days, instead of my old pen and paper book, I try or tend to start creating an OpenAPI contract instead. And I do that by coding a bit. So I just add the controllers I need, but I don't implement them. So there's no repository behind it, there's nothing there, just controller actions with the correct methods and something like Swagger Gen to create my OpenAPI spec. And like that, I can just give that OpenAPI spec to my colleagues and they can have a look and then correct me when I'm wrong, and then I can correct them when they're wrong. And it does work a bit better than pen and paper, I have to say. But, well, design something like that first before you just start implementing it. I promised I was going to talk about API Explorer as well. API Explorer is built into ASP.NET Core MVC. And it's actually an abstraction on top of it. It gives you metadata about your application. And you can just inject it anywhere in your code. So API Explorer, just inject that interface and you will get it. And you will see that it exposes a lot. It allows you to essentially get to know everything your API is possible from, simply by injecting that somewhere in your code. And that's also what happens, also what Swashbuckle does. It injects an API Explorer, and it uses that to know what the routes are, to know where your resources are, to know what types can be returned from your action method. So it can correctly use that in your API documentation. And, oh, don't need that. And a very interesting example in this case is the return type here. I was very much used to working with returning iAction result from all of my actions. Kind of liked it. All those methods that can be returned, like OK, not found, etc., they also eventually return an action result that implements it. So that was easy to do. But in ASP.NET Core 2.1, I think, they introduced action result of T. And the nice thing is that by returning an action result of T, API Explorer knows the type that's returned from your action. And because API Explorer knows the type, swashbuckle.asp.NET Core also knows the type and adds it to that list of models we saw in the spec. So by writing your code like this, you get better documentation out of the box. If not, you can already override. You can use produces attributes, something produces type, I think, to provide type if you don't want to use action result of T. But well, action result of T kind of works. All right. I think I already did the producing of the correct response types. So now it's time to have a look at the analyzers. And the one we are going to need or going to add is the MVC API analyzer. We are building an API after all. And I'm going to copy paste this so I can copy. That's very interesting. Okay, maybe it works like that. And let's add the analyzer. Manage. Oh, thank you. All right. So let's look for this. I did copy. I need the API analyzers. I am going to install 2.2 because I am, as said, running on ASP.NET Core 2 at this moment. Oh, let's have a look. Okay. There we go. So the API analyzer is installed, and you immediately see a few things showing up in my warnings. Oh, here. Apparently, a few methods return something that I didn't declare yet. Okay, let's have a look. 404 here. That's nicely underlined as well. Creating a book apparently returns a 404 potentially and a 201 potentially. And I didn't specify this, so this also isn't in my API specification. So now I can simply add produces response type attributes, and it automatically adds a 201 created and a 404 not found. It also added produces default response type. I already did that globally, so I can get rid of that. Now let's have a look at what this results in, and I think you can already guess that. Okay. So what was it? Creating a book. I think so. Here's my 201 and my 400, and then and my 404, and then the others I already created before. So API analyzers help, but they're not really foolproof yet. As you've seen, it also added the produces default response type attribute, which I already added globally. So it doesn't really make sense that it gets added again. And that's because those analyzers, and it's actually the way they implemented it with Roslyn, they only look at your controller. They don't look at what's defined globally. And they will also only look at the moment at what you specifically return from your action methods. So if you return a 404 not found, it will see that and it will try to add produces response type attribute. But your application can globally return a 406, a 500, a 401, a 403. It does not see that. So you can use it, or use it, definitely use it for a bit of help, but it doesn't really give you full coverage. You know your API better than API Analyzer does. So, well, use your own knowledge to improve on API Analyzer's knowledge. Okay. We're already better with our documentation, getting there. There's one specific thing I still want to add here or show here, because I really like this feature. It's new in OpenAPI 3. You know content negotiation, a mechanism to be able to return different or select different resource representations from the same endpoint. So for example, if you ask for application JSON, you get back a JSON representation of your author. If you ask for application XML, you get back the XML representation of an author. For example, a movie in JSON and XML, defined by what you pass through as an acceptor. That's a basic form of content negotiation, but there's a more advanced form as well. Because something like application JSON or XML, it tells us something about the data format of the representation, but it does not tell you anything about the actual type. So, for example, if I get an author with application JSON, I'm asking, okay, I want something back in JSON format, but you're not specifically asking to get an author back. You're just asking to get back whatever is behind the author's resource. By working with content types or media types in a more advanced level, you can expand on that. You could, for example, say, I want to get a movie or an author or whatever. And I have two different representations of, oh, this is movie, author, anyway. So this is a movie resource that returns an author. Never mind, that's a bit of a mistake on my slide, I think. So we want to get an author, but for some clients, an author might be better with a first name and a last name field. For other clients, the author might be better if first name and last name are concatenated. This is a very simple example. You can really go far with variation in this. Well, if you want to do something like that, these are still different representations of the same resource. These are still two representations of the same author. But with application JSON, application XML, you don't have a way to state that you want one with first name and last name separately or concatenated. And that's where vendor-specific media types come into play. So you simply create your own media types. And you state, okay, I want the author. I've been mixing up a few things here. Anyway, you create the media type and you say, I want that one in a regular version, or I want it with a concatenated name. That's something that happens quite often with RESTful APIs, at least, because of the possibilities it offers. You can be very strict. Your contract between client and server becomes stricter, which also makes it less error prone and makes the client more certain of what it's going to receive. So I really like that approach. It's also used for versioning, by the way, versioned media types. But up until OpenAPI 3, this wasn't supported by OpenAPI. And now it is. Now you can actually state that for one response type, 200, you can get back content in 3 different formats, let's say. You can ask for a regular book. You can ask for a regular book by using a specific media type. So application JSON returns a regular book. Marvin.book plus JSON returns that same book format. But if you ask for book with concatenated author name plus JSON, you want to get back another type. The only thing that kind of sucks is that Swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core doesn't yet support this out of the box. They are busy implementing support for OpenAPI 3, but it's not fully implemented yet. So it does take a little bit of additional work. But luckily, it can be done. Now, I did use book as an example, I think, here. Yeah. Okay, let's have a look at this. This is my code, and I have 2 methods here to get a book. Here, and here, get book with concatenated author name, get book. They both return, they both live at the same URI, so book ID. But the one is routed to when the media type is application JSON or marvin.book plus JSON. The other one is routed to when the media type is book with concatenated author name plus JSON. So this is how I want it to show up in my OpenAPI specification. And you might see that I use the API Explorer settings ignore API attribute here. What that does is it tells API Explorer to ignore this action. So there will be no metadata in API Explorer showing up for this action. And why is that? Well, if we have a look at what will happen if I don't use that. Was I still running again? There we go. We get this. And if we have a look at the error, yeah, this is probably a bit small. I'm gonna try and make it a bit bigger. So this is what the error that's returned states. This is actually wrong. Actions don't require unique method and path combinations for OpenAPI 3. Resources can live with different media types at the same URI. This is just a mistake in the error message, but it does mean that this isn't supported yet. So by ensuring that this action isn't included anymore, I avoid this error. But I don't solve my issue yet, because the marvin.book with concatenated author name media type and the resulting book representation is not in my documentation. Luckily, we can fix that, and that's what operation filters are for. So an operation filter allows me to quite specifically edit the operation that is added to an OpenAPI specification. So all those operations you've seen when I've shown the OpenAPI spec, they can be manipulated at will. So the workaround here is to create a getBook operation filter. And what I'm going to do is, what I actually want to I simply want one thing. I want the media type, book with concatenated author name, to show up in that drop-down list next to application JSON. That's what I want. The rest of the code in ASP.NET Core ensures that the correct type is returned. So I look for the getBook operation, which is this one. So once the operation filter for this operation is triggered, I say, well, okay, I want you to add this to the supported media types list. And I want you to also register a schema, which is my DTO in this case. I want you to register the schema from the book with concatenated author name DTO that matches this media type. So that should ensure that book with concatenated author name shows up in my models list, and book with concatenated author name plus JSON shows up in my media type list, so I can select it. One thing to do, though, I still have to tell Swagger that it should use this operation filter. There we go. And let's give this another try. Okay, it doesn't crash. That's good. And well, here's my book. So far, so good. Here's my book with concatenated author name. Seems okay. And if I look at my get, it's one book, not books. One book. We now have 4 different media types in my list that effectively result in different types being returned from the same endpoint, supported by OpenAPI 3 now. Okay. I did talk about generating client-side code, and I do still want to show you that, and I think I still have a few minutes, so let's have a look. Okay, let's leave this up and running because I need my specification. There we go. So I told you in the beginning that I kind of like Anthrax Studio for that. So what I need to do is get the link to my specification, paste it in here. Will I do it like this? Okay. Let's say I want to create, let's start with C#, for example. I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to change this too much. It's going to show you. You can really control what is generated and how your classes are generated. So, for example, I'm just going to leave everything at the default to generate output. And here we have about how many lines are this? More than 1,100 lines, of which at least 600 will be useful when creating a client application. So I will have my DTOs, which I can use. This also includes a lot of actions to already, for example, create book async. This is a full action I can use in a client application to create a book, so you don't have to write that anymore. I'm not always completely happy with what's generated, even though you can kind of configure it up to a certain level, but it does help getting started. It definitely helps me when I need to work on Angular stuff, which I'm not good at. So it's not my favorite thing to do. But, well, this already helps me in creating something to interact with my API with. So I kind of like this, the thing that this is possible from OpenAPI. And there was one more thing I think I said on my session description, which is testing. And this is more or less helpful, but it is something that can be done. You can obviously already test from your UI that's generated, but this to Postman in this case, which is something I tend to use a lot when testing my API, can also import Swagger specifications. So if I take this, let's have a look. Oh, this is not where I need to be. Import from link. Okay. Yep, import as API. Here is my API with my requests generated from my specification. And as you know, you can start writing tests on your requests from Postman in the test tab. So it does help a bit. It's not fully useful yet. It doesn't generate tests, but it helps with creating them afterwards. Okay. I think I have 2 more minutes, so that's about it. You can find the demo code on my GitHub. I'd say give it a try, OpenAPI. It's really nice for generating documentation, and with ASP.NET Core 2 and 3, you can really manipulate the documentation so it matches your API. And that's what's important. The documentation isn't just there to have a nice UI so we can click away a bit. It should really match the reality of your API. And by using operation filters, produces attributes, produces response type attributes, API analyzers, and your knowledge of your API, you should be able to get really good documentation. Okay, that's it for me. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or try and answer them. Yes.
First of all, thanks for your presentation.
You're welcome.
It was very interesting. I'm interested in, is there any tool to generate tests? Because you've shown that Postman...
It goes as close as this at the moment. as far as I know. This is the closest to generating tests that I've gotten with OpenAPI Spec.
The same swashbuckle, or what tool is it?
This. So if I test an API, I test it from something that's from the tool I use to create my requests. So in that case, I use Postman, in which I run my requests. So it's the Postman tests that I run to test the resources themselves.
But isn't it manual? I
Isn't
like manual tests. Or
no. Oh,
I don't know.
Oh,
Just what
wait.
is Postman?
No, you have Postman and you have Postman. You can automate that. So Postman is combined with Newman. Newman is a collection runner. So what you saw here was a Postman collection that's created this here. You do have to write the tests a bit after the requests have been created. Newman, linked to Postman from the same people, can be used on your build server to run such a full collection. So this is a collection, to run such a full collection of tests against your API. So have a look at Newman next to Postman. That's how I typically do it. I import my requests for my API. I then write the tests I need. And then on the build server, I run Newman from the collection I created here.
I see. Thanks. And second question, what if in case of different response statuses, we return different types of response? I know that it is a bit ugly, but...
you return different types of response? By which you mean?
I mean that in case if success, 200 status, we return some real data, just for easy get. Or for instance, 404 resource not found, we can return more information, what resource is not found.
So you return a 404 and then you return additional information inside of the response, okay? Yes, and...
is it possible to be described in OpenAPI, and is it handled by Swashbuckler and someone else?
That's actually a good question. I never do that. I use... By default, it will return the problem details object, but I think it can be done.
I guess it can be done by filtering, but it's still...
yeah, but I think it can be done. So if you have a producer's response type attribute, you can pass through... Oh, okay. It's still kind of visible here. You can pass through the type. So in that case, I would say return producer's response type status code 404 not found. And then you pass through the type you want to return. So that should do it.
Thanks.
Okay.
Any more questions? No. So I think lecture is over. Let's say thank you with a plus.
Thanks for coming.